Today is Monday, the 19th of August, and again, I'm going to turn back to the question of what's going on in the conflict in Ukraine. And let me start by saying that the news over the last 24-hour period is, perhaps you could almost argue, it is dominated by three negatives. Firstly, there has been no missile strike or attack of any kind by Ukraine on the Zaporozhye and Kursk nuclear power plants. A couple of days ago, we were hearing lots of reports from the Russian media that such an attack was pending and might happen at any time. But anyway, suffice to say that no such attack so far has taken place. Secondly, there's been lots of reports, lots of rumours that the the Ukrainians were preparing some secondary attack in the Kursk region to the west of the area in Kursk, where they have achieved their incursion. They've undertaken their incursion. There's been much talk about a village called Glushkova, from memory, that the Ukrainians might be ultimately directing themselves towards. And there's also been a multiplicity of films that the Ukrainians and others have been showing the destruction of various bridges across the Znaim River. And there's been much speculation that, as I said, this attack on Glushkova was coming, but so far there's been no news about it at all. So that's the second thing that hasn't happened. That's the second negative, if you like. The third negative is the most intriguing of all. Now, it was a comment made by Russia's foreign ministry spokesman, Maria Zakharova, in which she denied that direct or indirect talks had been taking place between Russia and Ukraine on the question of security for civilian infrastructure. Very careful choice of words, I thought. And she said that since no such talks had taken place, the Kursk offensive could not have derailed them. Now, that has been reported in many sources by many people as a denial of the Washington Post story, that the Russians and the Ukrainians had agreed to meet in Doha, in Qatar, that there were going to be talks there to discuss a possible cessation of missile and drone strikes by each side against the energy infrastructure of the other, that those talks had almost come to fruition, that an agreement of some kind had almost been reached, but that the Kursk incursion caused the Russians to stay away. And according to further reports, the Ukrainians then offered to turn up in Doha and continue the discussions, even though the Russians weren't coming. But the Qataris apparently or supposedly said no to that particular scheme also, that there was no point in having the Ukrainians come, because from a point of view, from a mediator's point of view, there was really no sense in continuing discussions of any sort whilst the Russians weren't there. One of the parties wasn't participating anymore. So there it is. It's been a further uncertainty about this story in the Washington Post. I have to say that Zakharova's words to me look like less than a complete denial. And several commentators that I've been reading, the more sophisticated and insightful and factual commentators, Eve Smith at Naked Capitalism, Andrew Karibko, and of course myself and Alex Christoforou, we did a program about this, have all been somewhat unconvinced by Zaharova's denial, and we all think that more than likely, or at least I certainly think more than likely, the story in the Washington Post, in some respects at least, is true. Now, that then brings us back to the key question of why would the Russians, at this stage in the war, agree to negotiate with the Ukrainians on that sort of basis. Now, the best discussion of this in print that I have seen has been made by Eve Smith on Naked Capitalism. Now, I should say that Alex Christoforou and I did a program on this very same topic for the Duran, and that will be appearing perhaps at the same time as this video is appearing, or roughly the same time. I'm not sure, but anyway, we've done a program, and on this topic. The program was made before I saw Eve Smith's article. Had I seen it before, I would probably have referenced it. But anyway, in a sense, perhaps it's not such a great problem, because as it happens, Eve Smith's conclusions are essentially very similar to the ones we arrived at in our discussion of this strange topic on the Duran. Now, just a few further things. Eve Smith, again, asks the question, why would the Russians agree to, or even consider agreeing to a deal like this? Could they really be thinking of such a deal at a time when they're winning the war, when their missile and drone strikes have devastated the Ukrainian energy system, when, according to John Helmer, the destruction of Ukraine's energy system is absolutely a part of the Russian military's overall plan for winning the war, and when Ukrainian strikes on the Russian energy system, well, this is my take perhaps more than Eve Smith's, have been almost completely ineffectual. Why would the Russians agree to this? And Eve Smith has a very interesting discussion about this whole topic, and as I said, you can find it on Naked Capitalism. But I take from her article 3 points, at least this is how I read the article, and I basically agree. The first point, and she makes this, I think, entirely valid point, is that the entire article appears to be based on an account from one anonymous diplomat. So it's not very strongly sourced and very strongly corroborated. It does seem that discussions probably did take place, but it may be that this diplomat is either not very well informed about the discussions between the Ukrainians and the Russians, or perhaps maybe he's gingering them up. He's making it appear that these discussions were much further advanced than they actually were. And here we can throw in another point that Eve Smith makes, which I think is absolutely true, and one which we discussed, Alex Christoforou and I have discussed extensively on the Duran, which is that these discussions may have happened because the Russians have been under some pressure from their friends amongst the BRIC states to engage the Ukrainians in talks to try to find some means to end the war. I've discussed this in my previous program on this channel. We've discussed this at length in the program that we've done for the Duran, and Eve Smith discusses it also And that there has been such pressure on the Russians is indisputable. The Chinese have at various times floated ideas about achieving some kind of mutually acceptable peace between Ukraine and Russia. The Brazilians and the Indians have been doing the same. Some of the BRIC states have been exchanging opinions about how peace in Ukraine might be achieved. It's important to stress that some of the BRICS leaders, individual BRICS leaders, especially President Lula in Brazil, might be sensing an opportunity here if they can act as successful mediators to enhance their own domestic positions. But it is also probably the case that the BRIC states in general would rather see the war end, and if an outcome can be achieved whereby the Russians achieve their stated objectives, control of the four regions and neutral status for Ukraine, securing thereby, as the Russians say, their western territories, then the BRIC states would probably prefer if the Russians accepted that and brought the war to an end. The war, the conflict that is being waged between Ukraine and Russia is a shock to the international system. It calls into question one of the BRIC states, Russia's commitment to the territorial integrity of another state, a member of the international community, which is, of course, Ukraine. The Russians, of course, have gone to painstaking length to explain their position on this. They've cited at length the question of self-determination. But, of course, countries like India, China, other countries within the global south that have many different separate communities and territories probably are, shall we say, somewhat nervous about arguments of that nature and would rather that the whole topic were taken away from the international agenda. So one can imagine that the Russians would be coming under some pressure from the BRIC states, and in fact there's no realistic doubt that they have been. This is one reason why Putin, for example, made that speech a few weeks ago in which he set out what his terms would be, that the four regions, that Ukraine should withdraw from the four regions completely and agree to neutral status. And I suspect that the BRIC states, for their part, are coalescing around this proposal, and they've been trying to get the Ukrainians to sit down with the Russians to negotiate with a view to getting this proposal accepted and to getting talks between the Russians and the Ukrainians started. And Qatar, which is not, of course, a member of the BRICS, but is closely aligned with some of the BRIC states, is probably acting as, if you like, a proxy for the BRICS group as a whole. Qatar has played significant mediation role in many ongoing conflicts. It's been trying to mediate between Israel and Hamas. It mediates between Ukraine and Russia on the question of prisoner exchanges. And one can imagine that Qatar would be prepared to use its good offices to try to mediate between the Russians and the Ukrainians in order to get talks started and proposals for some kind of mutual ceasefire on the electricity war might be the way to do it. So all of these things might have been floating around and circulating, but it could very well be that the diplomat who was talking to the Washington Post has made it look as if these discussions were much further advanced than they actually were. And E. Smith makes the point that it looks from the article itself, if you read it carefully, at least from one part of the article, that in fact there was no draft agreement of any kind, that the Russians and the Ukrainians had simply agreed to come to Doha to discuss a possible agreement to move towards a mutual ceasefire in the energy war. It was not the case that a whole agreement had been agreed and that all it needed was a signature to finalise it. So that's one theory. There is a further theory, and this is one that things start to become very interesting, because E. Smith also suggests, and this is a point where her analysis and ours on the Duran comes especially close. She speculated that what was happening was that the Ukrainians again were stringing the Russians and to some extent the BRIC states along, that they had no real interest in negotiations, that they were prepared to give the impression that they were interested in negotiations, and that in fact they had started planning the Kursk operation and were intending to launch it around 2 months ago. And according to the Washington Post article, perhaps by coincidence it was 2 months ago, that the talks, these feelers by each side towards the other to see about ending the energy war, that they started. Now, as E. Smith correctly says, this theory that the Ukrainians began in earnest to prepare for the Kursk operation 2 months ago comes from my source, which it does. It was 2 months ago that he contacted me and told me that the Russians believed that the Ukrainians were preparing an operation in Kursk and were starting to make moves to prepare for it. And that, of course, is the same time period that the Washington Post says these feelers between Ukraine and Russia for a mutual ceasefire in the energy war got underway. So it could be that what the Ukrainians were doing was trying to lull the Russians, to try to make them think that Ukraine was actually moving towards peace. There's been all kinds of statements to this effect by Zelensky himself. He's talked about inviting the Russians to the next peace conference. He's talked about, he sent his foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, to China, where Kuleba met with Wang Yi and told Wang Yi that Ukraine was prepared to talk, that apparently the Chinese were very frustrated in finding it very difficult to pin Kuleba down to any real detail. But anyway, it would not, of course, be the first time that Ukraine is trying to string along both the Russians and others, even as it pursues objectives which are more aligned with its maximalist goals. Now, if that was the game that Ukraine was playing, it was a deeply reckless one. It will not only have infuriated the Russians, who are now perhaps accustomed to this sort of double dealing, but it will have seriously upset the members of the BRIC states. And, well, the third suggestion that E. Smith makes is perhaps the most interesting of all, that the Russians might themselves be trying to think about the end game, they might be saying to themselves that military victory in Ukraine is now possible. In fact, it's not possible. It is in time a virtual certainty. But where exactly does this leave Russia? Does it leave Russia in control of territory it doesn't want and doesn't need, with a population that is hostile and which will have the backing of the West in any actions that it chooses to take to resist Russia, causing the Russians to commit resources to controlling a territory that they don't really want and have no interest in controlling? And that this might have been why the Russians might have been interested in discussions at this time. And that is an intriguing possibility and not one that should be completely discounted. Anyway, I don't think anyone can truly say what exactly has been going on about these talks. My own view is that talks of some kind were taking place. I think that the Russians were approaching them with great care. I think that the talks were taking place at the urgent suggestion of some of Russia's friends amongst the BRICS states. I think that the Russians probably were always skeptical about the outcome of these talks. I think that they might have been told that the talks would eventually lead to a breakthrough and negotiations to end the war. And it may be that the Russians were, that might have been something which made the Russians more interested to engage in the talks. But anyway, whatever the backstory to all of this is, something which one day, by the way, we are going to find out. Whatever the backstory is, it's very difficult to decipher it. And for the moment, what we can say is that the talks, the whole subject of talks, has been taken off the table. And this has just been confirmed, by the way, by Putin's senior foreign policy aide, Yuri Ushakov. He's just given an interview on Short Telegram, and he said this: at this point, given this venture, he's referring to the Kursk venture, we are not going to talk. Putin's proposals have not been annulled, but at the moment, the negotiation process is completely inappropriate. The time frame for any potential talks depends on the situation, including on the battlefield. And that's all that the Russians are going to say. In other words, they're not prepared to talk. They're not interested in talks. Negotiations are off the table. If the situation changes, well, the Russians will reconsider their position then. Putin has not annulled his proposal, but ultimately it will be events which will decide if there's any point in engaging in further talks. At the moment, there is no point in doing so. So that is what Ushakov, who's very close to Putin, has actually said. So that's all I'm going to say now about this diplomatic initiative in Doha. I've spent a fair amount of time discussing it, both in this program and in the two previous ones. I think, and of course we've devoted a whole program about it on the Duran. I think there is little point now in dwelling further on an episode about which we have very incomplete details, and which the Russians, of course, are denying has happened at all. I've said why I think it almost certainly did. But anyway, I think we've devoted enough time, I've devoted enough time to this particular episode, about which we have only the sketchiest details, and which the Russians are telling us in the clearest terms is now conclusively off the table. So there we are. Let's now look at the other two negatives. There's been no attack on the Kursk and Zaporozhye nuclear power plants. Now that could be because, as they say, the Ukrainians never intended to conduct such attacks. However, I have to say that though that may be true, it leaves again open the question of what Ukrainian strategies over the last 10 days or so have actually been. Now, right at the start of this operation, I made the straightforward point that the only conceivable military objective that the Ukrainians could aim for through their incursion into Kursk was the nuclear power plant. There is nothing else on this territory that the Ukrainians could feasibly or plausibly hope to capture. The city of Kursk, 1 million people apparently, obviously beyond their capabilities to capture with just 4 brigades. Anyway, Kursk nuclear power plant is the only thing that the Ukrainians could have captured which might have changed the overall situation in the war. And it's the only logical reason, therefore, why the Ukrainians could conduct an operation of this kind. And the Russians have been saying as much, not perhaps the government exactly, but various news media channels. Regatta talks about this as a straightforward fact. And General Alaudinov of the Russian military, he says that the Russians now have all of the information about the Ukrainian plans when they advanced into Kursk, and it was absolutely clear that the capture of the nuclear power plant in Kursk was the primary objective. Now, the Ukrainians haven't captured the Kursk nuclear power plant. They may have planned other attacks thereafter, but perhaps they've been deterred from doing that. But very interestingly, they're now giving a whole set of different explanations for why the attack in Kursk was launched and why, despite the fact that all it is doing is capturing empty villages, why Ukraine is persisting with it. So, in the initial days after the operation was launched, Mikhailo Podolyak, Zelensky's aide, came out and said that it was in order to put Ukraine in a stronger position in peace talks. But as I said at the time, the Russians would not engage in any peace talks whilst the Ukrainians were in possession of so much as a millimetre of pre-2014 Russia. So in fact, the operation in Kursk has actually destroyed the possibility of peace talks, not put Ukraine in a better position to engage in them. So that explanation of Podolyak's has started to fall away, and then it was replaced by a different one. The explanation this time, made by various people, including, by the way, Podolyak himself, was that the operation was intended to force the Russians to redeploy forces from the Donbass battlefronts. Except, of course, that has not happened. And now there is a general consensus that it has not happened. The only people who have redeployed forces from the Donbass battlefronts, massively to their own disadvantage, are the Ukrainians. The Russians have not done so. On the contrary, they're taking advantage of the weakening of the Donbass battlefronts caused by the Ukrainian redeployments to Kursk in order to accelerate and intensify their offensives. So that explanation has now fallen by the wayside. And Zelensky yesterday came up with the latest one, This is that it is all planned, apparently, it's all intended to create a buffer zone on Russian territory. This, presumably by analogy with the buffer zone on Ukrainian territory that the Russians, at Putin's instructions, are creating in Kharkiv region with the operations in Lipsy and Volchansk. Now, the problem with that, with the problem with Zelensky's explanation, is that it makes no sense at all. The Russian operation in Kharkiv is obviously intended in part to protect Belgorod from further attacks by the Ukrainians, of which there have been many, by the way, but it's also obviously functioning according to a military rationale. The Russians are in the process of capturing the important town of Volchansk, which is right on the border. As I've discussed in many programs, if the Russians are able to capture Volchansk, that means that they can start to break the Ukrainian supply lines to their defences further south, around Kupiansk and other places. Volchansk would be an important asset for the Russians to acquire in terms of their overall operations in Donbass. And in addition, over the last couple of days, the Russians have resumed operations in Lipsy, the village of Lipsy. A group of forces north is pressing the Ukrainians in Lipsy. Lipsy is the village that lies midway between the Russian border and Kharkiv city. It is also apparently on a hill. If the Russians are able to capture Lipsy and position their artillery there, they're in a very strong position to begin artillery shelling of Ukrainian positions in Kharkiv, which is, by the way, what they were doing sporadically over the course of 2022 when they were previously in control of Lipsy. So, the Russians have a military rationale for what they're doing in Kharkiv. The same cannot be said about any buffer zone, so-called buffer zone, that the Ukrainians create in Kursk. First of all, the Russians have not been shelling places like Sumy from their own territory. They have been conducting bombing attacks on Sumy, which have greatly intensified since the start of Ukraine's Kursk offensive. And of course, aircraft and glide bombs are not affected by the creation of a buffer zone 10 or 15 kilometers deep inside Kursk. And unlike Volchansk and Lipsy, the Ukrainians have not gained control of any territory in Kursk, which is strategically meaningful. Sudzha is not strategically meaningful in the way that Volchansk or Lipsy potentially would be, nor is any other village that the Ukrainians have been able to capture up to this time. In fact, if the Ukrainians felt that they needed a barrier to stop the Russians making some move in Sumy region, which is what Zelensky's latest comment might imply, then it would have made much more sense for them to do something completely different. Build layered fortifications in Sumy region, plant lots of minefields, create the kind of fortified lines that they said that they would create in Kharkiv but never did, and create a fortified barrier which it would be a challenge for the Russians to cross. Sending their forces into Kursk, where the Russians are able to inflict horrific punishment upon them, something which, by the way, the Western media is admitting, but which I will discuss shortly. Well, that is not the way to create a buffer zone. So, given that this is so, we come back to the only explanation that makes sense, which is the original one that I suggested, which was to capture the nuclear power plant in Kursk. There was no other possible Ukrainian objective for this operation. Everything else that the Ukrainians have been coming up with is not an explanation. It is a rationalization. As we discussed in a video that we have also done on this topic on the Duran, the reason the Ukrainians don't want to admit that the Kursk nuclear power plant was their objective is because, of course, they don't want to be seen to be attacking nuclear power plants. That would not be a good look at all. And of course, they don't want to admit either that the operation has already failed, that it has failed to achieve its objective. So, what we are left in Kursk is a stagnating battlefield. The Ukrainians are gathered in a small semicircle from villages like Korenovo and Snagust and all the way eastward to Suja. The Ukrainians have been bringing troops of Western journalists to Suja to assure everybody, the whole world, that they're in complete control of Suja, which probably they are, though, as I've said already, the Russians don't seem to be particularly affected by the fact that these journalists are there. They are continuing to say that they control the eastern outskirts of Suja, and I noticed that even the military summary channel still shows these eastern outskirts as being in the contested zone. Anyway, the point is, the Ukrainians continue to be in this small contested circle, and they haven't been able to move successfully beyond it. In fact, their operations are stagnating. We will come to this in more detail shortly. And then that brings us to the third negative, which is this attack that is supposed to be taking place, or which the Ukrainians are supposed to be intending to conduct towards the village of Glushkovo in order to try to bring another belt of territory in southern Kursk region under their control. What exactly the purpose of doing this would be, it's not entirely clear. It looks as if the Russians are in a position to establish fortified positions along the Znaim River, and it's a reasonable guess that they are doing that. But according to Redovka, the Russians are not only not intending to withdraw from Glushkovo, but that they have actually been reinforcing their positions there, and that it would become a difficult battle for the Ukrainians if they would try to launch an offensive in this area. And maybe the Ukrainians have come to realize that, and that is why, despite their destruction of three bridges along this small river, they've held back from launching the ground operation that has been so much talked about. Anyway, there we are. Those are the three negatives. I've gone over them in some detail. Let's now turn to the situation on the ground. And I'm going to start with the least important battlefront, which is Kursk. And I say the least important because despite the fact that it continues to attract huge amounts of publicity, especially in the West, it's clear that the battle in Kursk is stagnating. Stagnating at a very high cost to the Ukrainians. Now, Group of Forces North has done what it often tells us what it regularly does. It's provided us with its latest update of the situation over the last 24 hours. So they say that on August 18th, Group of Forces North continued to destroy the enemy in the border areas of Kursk region. In the direction of Korenovo, we repelled 2 Ukrainian attacks on Olgovka and one on Komarovka. It's the 2 same villages that the Ukrainians attempted to attack previously. On the previous day, I've discussed how the attack on Komarovka was an absolute disaster, with the Ukrainians suffering very heavy losses in that particular battle, and with an entire platoon of Ukrainian troops surrendering en masse, a fact, as I said, that was confirmed on film. Anyway, the Ukrainians apparently have tried again. And note again that that Group of Forces North once more essentially says that Olgovka and Komarovka are under Russian control. It's always been assumed that the that the Russians control Komarovka, but most mappers place Olgovka under Ukrainian control, but Group of Forces North is telling us otherwise. Anyway, they then go on to say, this is Group of Forces North, during the repelling of this attack, we destroyed up to 40 Ukrainian soldiers, 5 BBMs, I'm not quite sure what that is, and 3 pickup trucks. No enemy breakthrough was allowed. And then they go on to say something further. They say north of Sudzha, the intensity of Ukrainian attacks has decreased. During the day, the enemy made 1 unsuccessful attack on the village of Cherkaskoye Porechnoye, lost up to 10 fighters and 1 infantry fighting vehicle. In addition, we destroyed 2 Ukrainian sabotage and reconnaissance groups, totaling up to 12 soldiers, of whom 5 were taken prisoner. Now, again, to repeat, many reports that you read speak of these villages of Cherkaskoye, Porechnoye and Ruskoye, Porechnoye, and indeed Martinovka, as being either wholly or partly under Ukrainian control. According to Group of Forces North, all 3 are under Russian control, and the last attempt that the Ukrainians have made in this area, which was yesterday, was to capture Cherkaskoye, Porechnoye, and it has failed. The Russians also claim, by the way, to control the village of Malaya Lokhnya, which is located just to the west of these villages, against, again, the assumption most mappers have is that Malaya Lokhnya is controlled by the Ukrainians. But these accounts from Group of Forces North only make sense if Malaya Lokhnya is also under Russian control. And then the report goes on to say the Ukrainians increased the intensity of shelling of civilian infrastructure using Western-style multiple launch rocket systems and aviation. Air defense units of Group of Forces North effectively repelled these attacks. Over the course of the day, 90% of the missile and airstrikes were repelled. Airstrikes implies that the Ukrainian fighter jets have been operating. We don't quite know exactly what has happened because there's been no reports that I'm aware of Ukrainian fighter jets operating successfully on this territory. Or it could be that what we're talking about here are drones, but aviation seems to suggest fighter jets. As for the attacks by multiple launch rocket systems, that presumably relates to the attacks on the bridges on the Snaim River. And then Group of Forces North gives an unusually long account of what's going on in Kharkiv region. They say that in Volchansk, fighting continues. We foiled 2 attempts to transfer reinforcements across the Volcha River, killing up to 12 Ukrainian soldiers. In Lipsy, the enemy attempted to break through the defense of our forces with a force of up to 40 fighters on 4 BBMs. Again, I'm not sure what those are, supported by 2 tanks and an infantry fighting vehicle, but hit a minefield and lost a tank and the infantry fighting vehicle in the first minutes of the battle. This allowed us to systematically destroy the Ukrainian forces. Enemy losses amounted to 20 soldiers, 2 tanks, 2 infantry fighting vehicles. The remnants fled to Lipsy. Over the past 24 hours, the enemy losses amounted to 310, of whom more than 220 were in the Sumy direction. So Ukrainian losses yesterday in the Kursk and Sumy area amounted to 220, less than on the last couple of days, which also suggests a reduction in the intensity of the fighting. And then Group of Forces North provides us with its usual summary. The enemy continues to search for possible routes to break through the border in Belgorod region and expand the zone of active combat operations. In the border area, the Bestrashnik Special Forces, I don't quite know what those are, eliminated another enemy sabotage and reconnaissance group of up to 10 men, which is probably searching for weaknesses in our defences. Nevertheless, the enemy continues to concentrate its main forces in the border areas of Kursk region. To maintain the intensity of fighting in other areas, he uses groups of poorly trained, mobilized and former prisoners. An example of this is the above described suicidal attack in Lipsy. And then the summary finishes with the words, "Victory will be ours," and what is now the mandatory quote, this time from the Tsarist general, Russian general of the 18th century, Suvorov: "The war is over only when the last soldier is buried." A rather grim comment, actually, thinking about it. But anyway, that's what Group of Forces North says. If it reflects the spirit of their feeling, they would perhaps be willing to go on fighting until every single Ukrainian soldier has been put out of action. That they do not seem to be in any mood to compromise with the Ukrainians at all. So that's Group of Forces North. They're suggesting a stagnating battlefield. Ukrainians still dug in this small semicircle of villages close to Suja, launching what look like increasingly sporadic attempts to break out, to penetrate more deeply, but failing to do so. The Russians have them essentially boxed in, and with every day that passes, apparently more electronic warfare, more artillery being deployed in the area, more heavy equipment coming. And the Russian Air Force, especially helicopter gunships, the Kamov-52s and the Mi-28s, the Mi-28s, are very busy hunting the Ukrainians in this area. Anyway, the Russian Ministry of Defense has given again its own account, which is similar but not identical to the one provided by Group of Forces North. Units, and it reads as follows: units of Group of Forces North, supported by Army aviation and artillery fire, conduct reconnaissance and search operations to locate and eliminate small enemy sabotage groups in forest belts attempting to get deeper into Russian territory to the south of Skrilivka and Sheptukovka. I don't know where these places are, but notice only 2 reconnaissance groups this time, and there seems to be, at least for the moment, a significant reduction in this sort of activity. And then the Russian Defense Ministry goes on to say, attacks launched by assault detachments in the direction of Olgovka, Ruskoye Porechnoye and Cherkaskoye Porechnoye were repelled. Ukrainian losses amounted to 1 tank, 1 infantry fighting vehicle, 2 armoured fighting vehicles, and more than 25 Ukrainian troops. 4 Ukrainian servicemen were taken prisoner. This corresponds with what Group of Forces North has told us. And then they say that our aviation and artillery strikes, as well as actions of defending troops, inflicted losses on manpower and hardware clusters of the Ukrainian 22nd, 61st and 115th Mechanized Brigades and the 80th Air Assault Brigade near Borki, Bogdanovka, Vishnyovka, Viktorovka, Kozitska, Lyubimovka, Melovoye, Snagist, west of Martinovka and southeast of Korenovo. So that tells us that the Russians continue to launch air and missile strikes on the Ukrainian positions. And they also say that aviation delivered strikes at manpower and hardware concentrations of reserves of the Ukrainian 82nd Air Assault Brigade, 103rd and 129th Territorial Defense Brigades near Bazovka, Vorozhba, Kruzhik, Miropolye, Novaya Sech and Sadki in Sumy region. And then interestingly, they give a higher number of losses for the Ukrainians than Group of Forces North have done. They say that over the past 24 hours, Ukrainian losses amounted to more than 330 Ukrainian troops, 27 units of hardware, including 4 tanks, 1 infantry fighting vehicle, 3 armoured personnel carriers, 19 armoured fighting vehicles, 18 motor vehicles, 2 artillery guns, and 3 mortars. And they now put total Ukrainian losses in the Kursk offensive at 3,800 troops and 54 tanks and 26 infantry fighting vehicles. Now, some of these claims for Ukrainian losses are corroborated in the Western media. Forbes, for example, is writing that Ukrainian armoured vehicle losses in Kursk region are particularly high and that they are double the rate of what one finds on the other battlefronts. Now, just for the record, my source, whom I've spoken about on several occasions, has been saying for some time that the primary target of the Russians in Kursk region is destruction of Ukraine's armoured forces, its tanks and armoured vehicles, and it is those, more even than the infantry, that the Russians are targeting. Well, there we are. I discussed what I still believe to be the least important of the battlefronts. It's stagnating. The Ukrainians cannot break out. This is turned into a fire bag, as the Russians like to say. The Ukrainians are suffering very severe losses in Kursk region. They're making more attempts to launch further attacks outside the area of the fire bag to break the fire bag. So far, they are not succeeding. Maybe at some point they will, but for the moment they are not. And in the meantime, they're suffering extremely heavy losses. Now, way back in 2022, I remember that a Marine officer writing under the pen name Marinus wrote a long piece for the US Marine Corps Journal reviewing Russian tactics in the special military operation. He said that one of the things that the Russians like to do is to lure their enemy into firebags, the better to inflict devastating losses upon them. My source said that this is what they set out to do in Kursk. I don't know whether, well, I've discussed that many times. As I said, I leave it to you to decide whether or not you believe it. The fact is, whether you believe it or not, that is what Kursk has become. It has become a gigantic firebag in which Ukrainian armoured forces, which could have been used effectively in other places, are being systematically destroyed in significant numbers by the Russians. Now, there's been much talk about the embarrassment that this operation has inflicted upon the Russian government, how dismayed the Russian people supposedly are about it. My own sense is that the Russian population in general have received the news of this operation in Kursk fairly calmly up to this point. I get the sense that far from making them especially angry with their own government, it's made them even more angry with Ukraine and even more determined to conduct the war to, as they would say, a victorious conclusion. When the Russian government now says that it's not prepared to negotiate, I think it is in tune with public opinion. So, for the moment, I do not see any positives for the Ukrainians from this operation. Maybe something will happen over the next days or weeks which could change things. Maybe the Ukrainians will succeed in capturing this village of Glushkovo and the area around it. How that changes the overall situation, I myself am unable to see. It just extends the area of control that the Ukrainians would then have to defend even further, stretching their forces further. And I myself have to say, I cannot for the life of me see the point of that. Even as all this goes on, everywhere else, the front lines are collapsing. And the most dramatic news is coming from the Toretsk area. Now here we've received confirmation from various Ukrainian sources, not yet from the Russian Ministry of Defense, that New-York has fallen in its entirety. The Russian Defense Ministry is telling us that the Center Group of Forces has captured one of the largest settlements in the Dzerzhinsk agglomeration of Artyomovo. Artyomovo is the village of Zalizny. It's now fully under Russian control. Dzerzhinsk, of course, is the Russian name for Toretsk. It references, by the way, Felix Dzerzhinsky, one of Lenin's closest associates, the man who set up the Cheka, the organization that eventually became the Soviet secret police, and which was the ultimate precursor of the far better known, at least in the West, KGB. Just saying. Anyway, Artyomovo, Zalizny, is now under Russian control. And according to the Ukrainians, so is New York. Probably the Russians will confirm that tomorrow. And, well, there are lots of reports from Toretsk. they speak of the Russians having broken into Toretsk from the east. It seems that the coal mine near Zalizny has been fully captured by the Russians. It seems that earlier reports that the other coal mine near Pivnichny has been captured by the Russians may be wrong, but certainly the one near Zalizny has been captured. Lots of reports that there's now ongoing fighting inside Toretsk itself. The main battle for Toretsk has begun. The Russians have cut through all of the fortifications before Toretsk at bewildering speed, and all of the indications suggest that they're going to press on further and push more aggressively deeper into Toretsk itself. Again, I don't want to suggest that the Battle of Toretsk is about to end. There's going to be several days and probably weeks of intense fighting in this city, in this town. But we're now talking about street fighting. I don't know how heavily fortified the urban areas of Toretsk are. The direction of travel is clear. It's going to be only a matter of time before the Russians capture Toretsk. And Toretsk is one of that other ring of fortified cities, towns that the Ukrainians had established along their front lines, the 2014 and 2015 front lines, just as Krasnogorovka and Marinka and Avdiivka were the fortified lines that the Ukrainians had created around the capital of Donetsk, the capital of Donetsk region, Donetsk city. So Toretsk and its outlying villages, especially Niu-York, was the major fortified position from which the Ukrainians had basically laid the town of Gorlovka, one of the other big towns in Donetsk under Russian control, from where they had laid Gorlovka, put Gorlovka under siege. Well, it now looks as if the Toretsk is going to fall and the siege of Gorlovka is going to be broken. Now, the big question is are there any defenses to speak of north of Toretsk? As we have seen, the Ukrainians failed to build any significant fortifications behind Avdiivka. They seem to have assumed that Avdiivka was such a strong defensive position that the Russians would not be able to capture it, so they neglected the creation of strong fortified lines beyond it, and this has allowed the Russians to advance almost ceaselessly, capturing first Ocheretino and then all sorts of other places, up to the point that they are now literally outside Pokrovsk. Is this the same situation with Toretsk? Because if it is, if there are no major fortifications north of Toretsk, then the Russians could press forward all the way to Konstantinovka, the major town just south of Kramatorsk. If Konstantinovka falls, the eastern spoke of the main supply line which goes through Pokrovsk, ultimately to Dnipro, is broken, and the supply position of the Ukrainians in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk is going to start to become critical. And yes, the Ukrainians do have an alternative supply route from the north through Kharkiv region, but it's said to be less secure and less, the road is anyway less good, but it's said to be less secure. And of course, if Volchansk falls soon and Kupiansk also falls, then that roadway, that supply route is also insecure. So, this is a question I'm not able to answer. Whether there are fortified positions north of Toretsk, I don't know. But I am going to guess that there are not, that we're going to see the Russians, once Toretsk is captured, in a position to advance northwards towards Konstantinovka, with the road being in effect unimpeded. I think it will be easier for the Russians to advance in that direction than it was for them to advance from Avdiivka all the way to Pokrovsk. And my sense is that the distance also is significantly shorter. Now, that's already a very critical situation. But the Russian Defense Ministry has also given us some further news about another place that has apparently been captured, and that is the railway station at a place called Vyemka. Now, there's been some uncertainty, at least there is some uncertainty on my part, as to exactly where this place, this railway station, is actually located. But my own understanding is that this is the railway station near Siversk, north east of Razdolovka. The Russians have been gradually edging their way towards this railway station for some time. And of course, if Vyemka, the railway station, is indeed under Russian control, then I think we can say that the battle for Siversk itself is now about to begin. Now, Siversk, an important town, it's fairly small, about 10,000 people. It is now surrounded on virtually every side by advancing Russian troops. Keeping Siversk supplied must be becoming increasingly complicated for the Ukrainians. But the point is that if the Ukrainians lose Siversk, their entire position in northern Donbass begins to become less secure. The Ukrainians were able to hold on to Siversk in 2022, something which, in my opinion, unhinged Russian defenses in northern Donbass and created the conditions for Ukraine's successful autumn 2022 Kharkiv counteroffensive. If Siversk falls, then the Russians have much more secure foundations to build and to push eastwards beyond the Zherebets and Oskol rivers and recapture ultimately the small town of Liman, bringing themselves within artillery range of Slavyansk, the northern part of the Slavyansk-Kramatorsk conurbation. And again, perhaps not coincidentally with this news that the Russians have captured the Vyemka railway station, there's also now news that the Russians have crossed the Zherebets River. And I say news, it's been reported before, but this time there is definite film confirmation of this. And this is happening in the village of Makeyevka, which has been bitterly fought over between the Russians and a Ukrainian force supposedly largely made up of Latin American mercenaries, mostly from Colombia and Brazil, just saying. But anyway, it seems that the fight is very intense for this village. which has on previous occasions been reported as captured, or at least the eastern part of the village, on the east bank of the Zherebets River, has been reported captured. But now we have film evidence which shows Russian soldiers fighting in the western part of the village, on the west bank of the Zherebets River. And of course, if the Russians are able to complete the capture of this western part of the village, which they will, by the way, they will be in a position to establish a bridgehead, and that will open the way eventually for an advance towards Liman. And of course, if Liman is recaptured, then the whole Ukrainian position again near Slavyansk begins to look extremely insecure, but from a very, very much more dangerous position than the one the Ukrainians have been up to this point. So we see that the Russian offensive in central and northern Donbass continues unabated. And the same appears to be equally true in the Pokrovsk area. Now, there has been some speculation recently, especially on the military summary channel, that the Russian advance towards the village of Novogrodivka has been slowed, supposedly because in the area of Novogrodivka, there is a network, a complex network of coal mines and slag heaps, which form a natural fortified barrier behind which the Ukrainians can defend themselves. Now, this may be true, but I'm going to say that if you look at a map, it's fairly clear to me that even if these slag heaps and coal mines do form a fortified barrier of a sort, it's one that can be relatively easily bypassed from the south. And it is the case, in fact, that the Russians have been successfully advancing on precisely this area from the south. They've been capturing village after village near Novogrodivka, immediately to the east of Novogrodivka. So I'm far from convinced that it will be in fact possible to hold on to this area for quite as long as these reports about these big fortified positions would suggest. In addition, there is a main road, the E50, which passes from Karlovka and goes all the way up to Pokrovsk, skirts Selidovo from the north. The Russians are already on this road, supposedly. They've captured, according to some reports, they're in Karlovka, and they're in a position to move towards this road from the positions that they've captured in Novoselivka, Persha, and Zelanye. And if they establish themselves on this road and secure control of Karlovka, which they would undoubtedly be able to do, and if they also capture places like Ukr, which is located immediately south of this road, then it seems to me that they can skirt all of these defences, move round them, bypass them by driving up this road. They could attack Selidovo from the south, and if necessary, if they want to, they can also attack Novogrodivka from the south also. So anyway, there we go. So there's reports, as I said, that the Russians are clearing all the villages in this area, and it does look as if Selidovo and Ukrainsk and Novogrodivka are objectives. I am sure that the Russians have a plan as to how to capture these places, and that they're not going to allow some slag heaps and coal mines to slow them down for very long. One point that the Military Summary Channel, which has been discussing these coal mines and slag heaps in some detail, seems to have missed, is that apparently a significant number of them are owned by the Ukrainian oligarch Rinat Akhmetov, sometimes referred to as the richest man in Ukraine and a powerful political figure in his own right. And he is now bitterly complaining about the fact that these coal mines, this territory, the area around Pokrovsk, is in danger of falling under Russian control. And he's been saying that though the situation is not yet fully critical, something must be done in order to retrieve the situation. In fact, I have a quote for him. This comes from Slavyangrad, by the way. In case you haven't noticed, our situation in the Pokrovsk direction is not catastrophic yet, but definitely critical, which may soon become a cold shower for society after the Kursk euphoria. The Kursk offensive did not have the desired effect near Pokrovsk. The enemy not only did not withdraw his troops from Pokrovsk, but also strengthened them in certain directions. The enemy are located less than 10 kilometers from Pokrovsk. The enemy cannot take Novogrodovka, but is trying to bypass it from the side of Mykolaievka and reach the Karlovka-Pokrovsk highway near Selidovo. It's exactly what I said. The number of enemy troops approaching the enemy the Ukrainian brigades defending this area exceeds the personnel of the Ukrainian units several times. That's what Akhmetov is saying. That he's clearly not happy about the prospect of losing his coal mines, and he appears to be very much the dominant figure in the economy of Pokrovsk, and he's sounding the alarm bell. And he's clearly not happy about the way in which the war is conducted and about the diversion of forces, valuable forces to Kursk. And though he's saying that the situation is, at the moment, not catastrophic, it is critical, and yes, maybe the Russians won't be able to storm Novgorodovka right away, but they're intending to bypass it, to get round it. They're going to move to the E50 highway, and they'll be able to attack Novogrodovka from the south. So there we are. That is what Akhmetov is saying. And I suspect he's got all kinds of military and ex-military people giving him advice. There are rumours, for example, that he is the man who funded and basically set up the Azov Brigade. But I'm not going to speculate about that because I have no actual direct knowledge. Anyway, there we are. So, we continue to see a rapidly deteriorating situation. Now, I haven't talked about Pokrovsk itself because we've had less news. Some people see this as evidence that the Russians are at a standstill outside Pokrovsk, that they haven't yet managed to capture Grodivka. That may be true. Or perhaps it's a sign that the Russians are preparing something and that they're about to launch an even bigger attack. I noticed that some days ago, we're getting reports that the Russians have reached the village of Novoekonomichne, and in fact, there are reports now starting to appear that Novoekonomichne has actually been reached by Russian reconnaissance groups. I noticed that in its latest report about the fighting in Ukraine, the Russian Defense Ministry is referring to another village, Yelizavetka, located to the west by the way of Vozneshenka. And it looks as if something might be in the course of being prepared there as well. And bear in mind what Akhmetov and others are saying, that the Ukrainian defenders of Pokrovsk are heavily outnumbered. In previous battles, when towns were under siege, Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, Bakhmut, for example, the Ukrainian defenders actually outnumbered, by some accounts, the Russian attackers, or the forces were roughly equal in strength. The Russians, of course, had massive advantage in firepower, but the Ukrainians supposedly in those battles did outnumber in infantry the Russian attackers. This time, in the Pokrovsk area, all the reports are saying the same thing. The Ukrainians are outnumbered and massively outgunned. Well, we will see what happens. I'm going to guess that we'll get a clearer picture over the next few days, perhaps a week or so. In the meantime, President Putin himself, completely calm, has talks with the president of Azerbaijan in Baku. There's pictures of Putin sitting with President Aliyev of Azerbaijan and a woman who I presume is Aliyev's wife in what looks like a very comfortable setting in a guest house, and they seem to be talking fairly happily with each other. Apparently a comprehensive package of measures is going to be agreed between these two countries. Obviously, whatever it is that's going on the battlefronts, it's not so urgent that Putin feels that he has to dash back to Moscow to take charge, and clearly he also believes that his position in Moscow is totally secure, so that he can leave the city and go on this kind of venture to places like Azerbaijan, confident that when he gets back, the situation will be calm and stable and fully under control. So that's my discussion of events this week. It's been completely taken up by events in Ukraine. I'm not, as I said, going to talk about the Qatar brokered energy war ceasefire negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians that the Washington Post was talking about. Tomorrow, I'm going to also try and touch again on the situation in the Middle East, where it looks to me as if the ceasefire negotiations that the Americans are trying to broker between Hamas and Israel are also on the verge of breakdown. Anyway, one way or the other, the war in Ukraine is intensifying. I think that the crisis that I've been long predicting in Ukraine's defenses is now almost upon us. You remember my previous videos, from a month or so ago, I was saying that people were underestimating how bad the situation for Ukraine is becoming. I think that is now becoming increasingly clear. It could be that the next couple of weeks and months leading up to the time of the presidential election in the United States are going to be very, very fraught indeed on the battlefields of Ukraine. Well, that's me for today. Remember, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget also that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. You can also support our work by going to our shop, links under this video. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.